Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Jnanavarthini, FDPPA's weekly knowledge session. DPDPA 2023 is here, and the privacy community has been deliberating and interpreting the Act and its advantages and drawbacks. Our speaker of the day, Dr. Pankaj Sahay, is bringing a different perspective to DPDPA, how it misses or messes the fundamentals. Dr. Pankaj Sahay is a public policy and government relations professional with extensive experience in standardization, regulatory affairs, and intellectual property management. He has contributed to ISO and BIS working groups on standardization. He is a graduate of IIT Kanpur, holds a doctoral degree from IISc Bangalore and a diploma in cyber laws from NALSA. He has worked in organizations like Saskin and Infosys and also been in academic roles in NMIMS, SP Jain School of Global Management and Velinka Institute of Management. Welcome, Dr. Sahay. Happy to have you here. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me on this session. So let's get started. So we are going to be talking today about the Digital Personal Data Act 2023, which, as we all know, was made into an act a couple of months back earlier this year in August. And there's been a lot of debate on it and a lot of different perspectives. And I have a different perspective. I feel there are some things, which the act misses. So I just put down some of my thoughts for everyone to think about, and we can have a discussion after this presentation is over. So next slide, please. Yeah. So, okay. So what I will do is DPDP. Okay. So every word in that acronym, Digital Personal Data, every word of that, and protection, I'll take a look at that at each one of these. And as we all know, the genesis of the entire data protection thing worldwide was to do with privacy being a fundamental right in India after the Puttaswamy judgment. So that is where we come from. So then one can look at, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 8, which talks about everyone having a right to effective remedy for acts violating the fundamental rights. Privacy being a fundamental right, that is why I chose to look at this bill in the perspective of human rights and fundamental rights. And to Article 19, right to freedom of opinion and expression, that is also important because personal data and expression, on the internet, it's all over the place. So this is another relevant article which comes into play. I have published a brief analysis with recommendations, which is available on Swarajya Act. So today I'll be talking about some of the things out here in this analysis, though not all of them. So next slide, please. Okay, so first, what is digital? So what is digital and what is the impact on privacy? So the first thing we note is that the word digital is not defined in the act, digitized. So what is digital? It's sort of assumed, one doesn't really know, that digital means something which is implemented on a digital computer, so to speak, which is implemented using electronic artifacts, whether it is logic gates, flip-flops, and so on, but one doesn't know really. So digital also has to do with digits, whether it's binary, decimal, or whatever. Are you talking about a digital computer? Quantum computing is on the threshold, so where do you place that in the context of this? And the basic question is about my privacy. That was the genesis of it, right? My rights, my privacy. So, and I'm worried about my data and my privacy, whether it's violated or not, and how to protect that. So we know that, for example, first mile, here the capture of signals, for example, is using light and sound waves, or it could be pressure sensors from the body, whatever. And very often they may be analog. And then there's a digital to analog to digital converter. We also, if we are talking about quantum mechanics, then you can talk about qubits. So one can say it's digital, but then quantum mechanics fundamentally uses very different concepts. For example, matter waves, wave particle duality, and so on. So does it belong to the same class? And waves being, analog, continuous entities. And the other thing about quantum computing is that we are most likely to lose all our encryption keys and our security once that comes into the picture. So then do we want to have that, and does this bill want to address that? So where are we, with this thing digital? Last mile also, for example, if someone saves my data on something which is an analog medium, for example, tapes, printout, photos, whatever, then I don't have control over it. What happens to my privacy? First mile and last mile, right? So the other thing to worry about is you have to have digital converters and analog to digital converters. So what is the status of that, and where is the control and position of that in this bill? One more thing, let's say we are talking about digital now. Let's say I write down some discrete variables, age, temperature, fever, whatever. I write digits on paper. So that is also digital, is it not? I'm asking a question. And therefore, is it protected? If you take a printout in any binary or decimal notation, that's also digital or not? Next slide, please. Okay, so now let us see what happens in the case of different assets. So if we have coins, for example, cash coins, a ballot. Now, these are, basically you are digitizing, if you're talking about money, you are digitizing the economic value, so to speak, and storing that on a medium which is paper or metal. Okay. Now online, that storage medium becomes your electronic flip-flop or transistor, whatever that is. But that doesn't mean it is not digital, or does it? Now suppose you are talking about a ballot. Now, is that not a digitization of your preference, which might be some vague, idea in someone's head? Then you say, okay, say yes or no. You vote or you do not vote. So is that not digital in some sense? And what about the economy? If you're writing it in dollars, you're using numbers, digits, dollars, etc. We've come away from the barter system. Is that or is that not digital? So the point I'm getting at is that the storage and transfer medium is different, but then is it not digital, for example, in the case of cash? Okay. The other thing is you can implement, binary or digital arithmetic using mechanical artifacts, ropes, pulleys, stones, etc. That is also possible. Now, where does this bill say that you have to have electronic storage and flip-flops? Or does it imply that? Okay. So now I'm asking a question. Should the basic properties of the asset and my rights, how or why should that be affected because it is implemented on some kind of medium and not on paper? And how would, more importantly, why and how should my fundamental rights, beginning with privacy, for example, which we are talking about here, and other rights, why should they change depending on the nature of the medium and how you're storing it? Now take a look at copyrights, for example. Suppose there's a song, you're singing a song, or there's a song or whatever piece of code about something, then your rights remain whether or not, you're performing, whether you capture it in some file format, whether you compile it, you have any kind of file. The right in the copyright remains. The value might change, because it's in a different format. So that's a different aspect, but your rights remain as such. And privacy, what do I want finally? That my privacy, that is my requirement. That should not be affected, irrespective of whether it is first mile or last mile or something happening in between them. So that is my thing. And whether it's analog or digital, because it's all part of the same one system. Next slide, please. Okay, we look at the other D in the title of the bill. So there are different definitions of data in the IT Act, which is broader, and in the DPDPA, which is this act, it's a more simple and narrow definition. See, the only thing I will make here is an observation that, if these two definitions are different and if there's a conflict arising out of that, then according to the section in DPDPA, it is this act which will dominate in case of conflict. So that remains to be seen how it's going to play out. The second thing is to look at something called the idea expression dichotomy. Now you have, for example, data set. So you are going, let's say, from place A to place B, you're going from Bangalore to Delhi to Dubai, London, whatever. You can have different data sets which capture the same information essentially, okay? So it can be a table, it can be some Excel file, it can be a graph, it can be diagrams, GPS locations, audio, video capture, email, whatever. All of them give the same information that you're going from here to there. The format is different, the data sets are different, you know. So, but the information is yours, it is personal information, and they all give the same information. What does data mining do? It runs algorithms to extract the information from the data sets, right? So now we have this concept of the idea expression dichotomy, that data, because it's a representation and you have data sets which express the same information which is contained in it, that is the idea in it. So data is on the expression side of the dichotomy. So to speak, on the copyright side of things, not on the patent side of things, because patent talks about the ideas and the algorithms, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to illustrate the point, you can have, for example, someone writes, you can have copyright on a piece of code that you have written, but that doesn't mean that automatically you have rights to the underlying algorithm, which is patentable, or that you have underlying rights to the underlying patents. So you can write or modify code, but not use the code or the idea algorithm expressed by it, typically, unless you have also the rights to the patent and the idea. So now let us notice one thing, that the IT services industry, typically it has grown and grown so big precisely because of the use of this idea expression dichotomy. So what happens in outsourcing typically? So the client makes a master agreement where they give the background intellectual property under copyrights. So they are giving you the piece of code or whatever has been done earlier from wherever. They give it to you under copyright. So you can modify that code, you can play around with that code, you can do what you want, but you can't execute that. You can't run that program. So the right is not given under patents, but it is given only under copyright. And this is a very cardinal principle of law as well. So I want to apply the same thing out here in the case of data, and particularly in the case of personal data. So personal data, if you're talking about data sets, so likewise, you can have one part which is on the expression side of the idea expression dichotomy, like you have the copyright thing, and then the other side of the dichotomy, which is on the information side, which is belonging to the person, but it has to do with the information part of the idea expression dichotomy. So now, because it is my personal data, then what do you mean by personal? It belongs to me, right? So I have all rights to information contained in it. Even if someone had a role to play, for example, in giving the technology, the camera or whatever for the capture, GPS location, whatever. So that is only on the expression, the data set side of things. But the information in it, that I'm going from here to Dubai, has only and only to do with me and nobody else. So that part is purely mine, no matter who, what technology, what service provider comes into the picture. So that is the point I'm trying to make here in the case of data. Next slide, please. Okay, now I come to the other P, which is personal data. So the genesis of data protection, personal data protection, has been privacy, and that is why the focus on identifiability and de-identifiability. But I'm asking a question, is identifiability the only thing which we should worry about? So let's take a look at that. So section 2U in the act says identifiability, or rather personal data, means any data about an individual who's identifiable by or in relation to such data. Okay, so identifiability is there, whether you like it or not, as far as this bill is concerned. Now let's take out some other assets. My personal data is my asset, it belongs to me, right? So let's take a look at, for example, what happens in the case of ornaments, gold, currency, cash, furniture, property, oil, whatever you like. Or in the case of copyright, suppose you have a song, audio, video clip in any kind of format, exe files, whatever. Now what happens is the value in the assets may change due to a change in form. That is different. But what about the identifiability part? Whether it's ornament, suppose someone melts the gold, you still have ownership of the gold, whether or not it is identifiable, or you are identifiable, or even the ornament is identifiable, and there's still value in the gold, and you are still the rightful owner of it, and you have all rights to it. It doesn't matter. Identifiability is a separate aspect. The same thing about copyrights. So the value of the asset, of these assets, typically is not linked that way in that case to identifiability. Okay. Now personal data belongs to the person. So what I would want, think about it, grant legal recognition to ownership and exclusive rights in the same manner. Otherwise, the question arises, then what is personal and what is fundamental if I don't even own it, right? So then what does it mean? That I'm losing control, I'm losing rights because of the fact that the value in the asset is not recognized. The other thing to notice is that de-identifiability and anonymization, they are not exactly solved problems in academia. Okay, there are issues with it. If you have mergers and acquisitions, collating data sets, etc., that may lead to identification. So there's an issue with identification in any case. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll give you an example. So this was just about the concept. Let's say someone takes a survey, whether you're vaccinated or not, whether you got COVID after the vaccine, yes or no. So it's just binary 1 or 0. You may or may not want to capture the identifier's name or whatever that is, right? And whether or not you de-identify the data set later, the item of interest is independent of who. Why? Because that is the value that you want in the survey. It comes from a living human person, and that is what you want. Otherwise, why wouldn't you do your simulation? Today, you can do any kind of simulation on anything. And this is even more important because now you have cyber physical systems. So the human being is linked to the internet, and everything directly from your body is going on the net. Okay. So the point being, whether or not you have something de-identified, the value in this data set, for example, is precisely because it comes from a living human person, because it is personal data, right? So therefore, it has got value in it, irrespective of the identifiability aspect. And therefore, I want ownership and exclusive rights on that. Next slide, please. Okay. So we are losing out on so many, the value loss, strategic cost, and so on, because we are not able to capture this aspect. Next slide, please. Okay, now we come to the fourth one, the P, that is protection. Now the act, the opening paragraph says an act to provide for the processing of digital personal data, which recognizes the right of individuals to protect. Now, if it is a digital personal data protection, well, maybe it should provide for the protection of digital personal data. But anyway, let's not get into that. But the genesis of this was privacy, which is a fundamental right. So I'm interested in looking at the whole bundle of fundamental rights, because privacy doesn't occur, in itself. How does it suddenly appear? It comes because of other rights which exist in the data, because it is personal data, and privacy is just one of those rights. So then I'll take a brief look at what is the nature of personal data information, what attributes and rights. A brief look at ecosystem. That is important because the key to the entire act is the word fiduciary, which means trust. You use the word fiduciary when there's an item of trust. Then we'll look at a couple of things: purpose, limitation, consent, what does it do or what does it miss? And as I said, my detailed analysis is on this link. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm giving you the overall, snapshot of the DPDPA Act. So first thing to notice is, okay, the penalty. There's a priori cap on the penalty of 250 crores. That's something like $30 million. That includes various factors, nature of the offense, gravity, repeat nature, everything that you can think about. Now, anyway, so now since there's a priori cap, compare that with what happens, for example, in the US and European Union. Regulators have slammed a penalty on big tech like Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and that goes in the range of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars for 1 year, 2 years, whatever that is, for privacy violations, time, coercion, and so on and so forth. So you take a look at this, a priori cap, and that too it is a priori. So, well, it's peanuts. So big tech they budget similar accounts for 1 or 2 years to account for all of these things, so they know it's going to happen. So what difference is it going to make to big tech? They won't bat an eyelid, okay? So basically, because of this a priori cap, what happens is the small guys who come below this a priori cap, whether it is 250 crores or whatever it is, it doesn't compare with $1 billion anyway. So these are the guys who are going to take the flak, okay? And the other thing to notice is that the penalty at the end of the day, it doesn't go to the person who is harmed. It doesn't go to the data principal who's harmed, who's at risk or loss of privacy, whatever. It goes to the Consolidated Fund of India. So the money, the compensation also doesn't go to me. Then what is it that I'm getting? What is the protection I'm getting in this act? I mean, I can have a grievance, I can raise a complaint, but at the end of the day, who makes the money? Although I am harmed, well, it's the government. Okay, fine. So then there was maybe the IT Act 2000 and there was 43A in the amendment 2008 for negligent handling of data, and I would get compensation, in that case. But then DPDPA, this bill overrides that case. It explicitly removes that and also says that in the case of conflicts, it is this act that is the DPDPA, which will override the other act. So that means I could have got compensation under 43A, but now it is not possible. So this has knocked it off. So it looks as if, it's the government which owns me and my data, and it's living off my misery. I mean, what else does it look like? The other thing that has been watered down is the right to information. So that is also, you cannot ask for information from a public servant, etc. So I don't want to go too deep into that. So primarily, because the inquiry, when it happens, it's basically to do with the compliance. That is the purpose of the inquiry, and whether there has been something which incurs a penalty or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's see what does the act give. So what are the rights and remedies that the data principal have for those, of course, under the penalty cap? The big guys anyway are flying high. So the core concept is what? Fiduciary, which means an element of trust, putting the interests of the data principal ahead of the fiduciary's interest. So what is the recourse remedy that you have? Now, there are a couple of things out here. There's a click wrap agreement. Then since you're using the word fiduciary and trust, so what happens in case there's breach of trust, breach of agreement, or negligence? So negligence part has been shot down, as we saw. 43 is also gone. And now the queer thing is, privacy was the genesis of all such acts, protection of personal data. That word itself doesn't exist in the act. Now, what rights and protections are given to the data principal? That is quite minimal. Knowledge of what is happening, who is doing it, editing, erasure, nomination, and right to grievance redressal. And then you have one duty, failing which, that is, if you give some false information, you can't correct it, you'll be slammed with a penalty of up to 10,000 rupees. But then, what do I have, in terms of remedy or compensation if my privacy is violated or some other right has been violated or I'm suffering a harm and loss to me? Nothing much. So you raise a complaint and you go to the villain of the piece, which is the data fiduciary. You write to him if you're not happy with his response in a week or whatever. Then you go to the data protection board. Now the DPB is like, it's created as an independent entity. It's all in all kind of exclusive authority and jurisdiction, powers of a civil court, and very nicely it insulates this process from every other civil authority and civil process. So no injunctions. And who is the DPB accountable to? We don't know as far as this bill is concerned. It's not accountable to the parliament. Probably it should be. That is the right place. Okay. So just to ask a question out here, suppose you have, intellectual property, copyrights and patents and, infringement, etc. happening, and the court says, okay, well, let's protect intellectual property with this kind of framework. Will people agree? And what will you call that protection? Then what about, I'm not even talking about copyright and patents. So what about fundamental rights and privacy? You call that protection? So that is the question. Next slide, please. Okay, so rights and remedies of the data principal, once again. So this is how the inquiry goes. So now there's an inquiry lying with the DPB. So how does it go? So now the fiduciary will go and meet the DPP saying, oh, there's a complaint. The DPP will call him, do the inquiry, etc., etc. So now the fiduciary says, okay, I'll put this patch. There's a data breach, or there's a violation in the obligations, or something you have overstepped, the rights of the data principle, which is basically the knowledge editing, information erasure, could be one of those. Okay, so the fiduciary talks to the DPP and says, okay, I'll do this. I'll put this patch. Maybe I'll put this software. I'll upgrade this. I'll deploy it in a couple of months. Whatever, can be anything. But then the DPP says, okay, no. So there's a negotiation between the two of them, and the DPP can say, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And this guy, finally they agree. Once they agree, then there's a bar on the proceedings. Now it doesn't matter, whether you are harmed or you have been harmed or you are continuing to be harmed, as long as the DPP has accepted it. You are not even party to these proceedings. That is the point, Unlike what happens when you go to, for example, a court or a police station or whatever. So, first of all, even before the inquiry happens, the DPP will not proceed with the inquiry unless there's sufficient grounds. And then they will see whether the non-compliance. So non-compliance has to do with what is given in the bill. It doesn't have to do at this stage with what is the harm and loss happening to the data principle. So the non-compliance is significant. So what is significant? That is not defined. Is it one person? One person is always insignificant. 100 is also can be taken to be insignificant. What is significant? 100, 1 million? Nobody knows. Okay. And penalty only if the DPDP determines finally non-compliance. Okay, so it is the compliance which is the issue. So this is basically an audit framework which is triggered by the grievance of the data principle. That is what it is, more or less. Okay, so non-compliance turns out to be significant, and then there's a penalty, and we know how the penalty goes with an a priori cap, etc., etc. And finally, I don't get anything out of it. So what the hell? Okay, now let's see other aspects of this. The rules can be rules which are made. There are certain aspects, for example, localization related and other places. The rules can be modified or stopped by the parliament only if both of them agree to stop it. Okay, so the rules are made by the executive. Typically, they may be unelected persons, usually lobbyists, subject to changing governments, whatever. And the point about the rules is, and we'll see this later also, that the notification or the rules made, that goes through without prejudice. So suppose like 1 month or 2 months down the line, the parliamentary, both houses, that is, they disagree. Then what happens is, without prejudice to what has happened when the rules were made and between the time they were stopped, it is as if the rules apply and you can use them. Okay, so that is without prejudice. So as it is, it goes through. And maybe this is coming from the bricks and mortar economy, but I don't think this is good for the knowledge economy, where one mouse click does all the damage. Now, there's one aspect about conflict with other laws. This bill overrides other laws in case of conflicts. But for example, if you have a click wrap agreement and they tie you up because of your personal data and bring you into the DPDPA, and you probably have reliefs available under other laws, that might be negated, the way 43A got negated. So just to give an example, the Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. Okay, they had A+ ratings, so all that compliance, non-compliance thing is taken care of. They had flying ratings, all the best. But was that good enough to save the deposits or depositors, or did it safeguard their rights? Well, no. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talk about consent because a big deal has been made about consent. So forget the first part, just go to the last 1 or 2 paragraphs, the example. It can be a thing which is happening physically. It can also be now, because you can have telemedicine, remote surgery, remote medicine, whatever. One can think of any kind of example. Let's say there's a clinical trial and there's some anesthesia process which is going on. Person wakes up in the middle of the procedure on the operating table. Now, what is the surgeon going to do? Is he still going to continue operating, or is he going to stop? Even if the consent forms have been signed. So then what is the thing which kicks in, the right to life and the principle of no harm, which is what the doctor will use, and then stop the process, right? And then if he does not do that, then he will be held accountable for that. even if consent has been given. So this is the kind of situation which should be applicable even in the data domain, because, for example, you have cyber physical systems. And to talk about consent, consent is just the starting point of saying that you are not committing a crime because it's not theft. But then everything about consent doesn't mean all the rights and situations are the same. Your friend, your spouse, whoever, they all give consent, but are they all on the same plane? So the question again is going back to what are the rights and remedies you have? Do you have compensation or not? And we don't have compensation anyway, right? Next slide, please. Okay, talk about purpose limitation and contrast it with data and access limitation and control. Give an example. Let's say a courier guy, DHL or FedEx or whoever you want, he comes home for a pickup. He has to pick up a parcel and deliver it. So he requires a delivery address, the person's name, contacts, his phone number, whatever. So I have the contacts, I have the, my pocket diary. I reach into my pocket, look up the contacts and giving exactly that one piece of information. Or the other way around, the courier guy, he puts his hand into my pocket, he flips through my diary, and then he will select, he will ask me and I will indicate, and then he will do it. So now, see, in terms of purpose limitation, they're both the same, right? Because the purpose is delivery. So on that score, it doesn't seem to be an excess, because the courier guy is not, for example, selling it or using it for advertising or whatever else. In both the cases, he's just using it for the delivery. But then in the second case, the moment he puts his hand inside my pocket, it's already a violation. It's a trespass, violation of my privacy. Why should he go through my entire contact list? Why should he have access to it? Okay. Why am I saying that? Because many things online happen like this. Apps will shut down. They want everything about everything on your phone, for example, and you don't check that box, it shuts down. So what in this act prevents such activity, such agreements? Because my privacy has to do with that. And why are you exceeding all of that? So the question is, what about data limitation and access control for this purpose? Who decides? Do I decide jointly with the fiduciary? Is this bill doing that explicitly? No, it's not doing that explicitly. It's the fiduciary who's doing that. Okay. So am I a passive person? Next slide, please. Okay, now we come to localization. That is 16.1 in this act. So blacklist by country specific blacklist is possible after notification, but the default transfer outside India is allowed. So that is the default case. Okay. But now let's look at the main thing. The key to this entire act is fiduciary, which means trust. Trust is not a territorial attribute, it's a human attribute. So the question is not which territory or country. That is not really the point. The point is who, which is the person or the company or the legal person or the corporation which is handling it. And also if you have, gone abroad for that matter, what is the political system, what is the regulatory system, etc., etc. All that comes into play later. But it starts with the fiduciary. Do you trust that guy? And what is the paradigm for cyber security? The paradigm is zero trust. And here you are saying default, we can send personal data, mind you. Distinguish between personal data and data in general. Personal data is everything about me. There is more information about me than in the during the Cold War. It was the spies and all who could ever dig personal data about me. There's much more personal data about me all over the place. So cyber security, zero trust, fundamental rights. Okay, I have my fundamental right to free speech. In the US, you have a right to bear arms. So why is it there? Because your fundamental rights, they outline the scope and limitations of how much you should and can trust the state. So there's a limit to the trust. And here the state is acting as if it owns the data and it trusts everyone. So default transfer outside India is allowed. It doesn't really, add up. Anyway, so 16.2. So fine. So keeping that into account, and you can have some, for example, health or financial sensitive personal information, you can restrict the transfer using other laws. So that is possible because 16.2 allows it, and your section on conflicts does not apply here because that is the way this law is worded. So in that case, you can have different laws for different verticals. So that is possible. But all the same, this default transfer outside and tying it to territory, that doesn't really go down well. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at data flows and impact. So if your data is going outside, then this is important, what is happening. So geopolitically, oil has cost and controls, then why not data? Data is the new oil, right? And then we saw what happened, for example, in the Hindenburg case and Soros case, they were using data, right? It's not even personal data. Imagine what could have happened if personal data about some of the actors could have been brought into picture. The entire stock market could have gone down. It could have been destroyed. And what is your cap of 250 crores going to do out here? The next point, raw material and competitive advantage. This is a pretty important point. I don't know if people have given enough thought to it. So there was this policy called the freight equalization policy. So we know in India, the mineral rich states, for example, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, a couple of others, they had all the minerals. But at the same time, they were not able to develop. No really factories out there, no industry out there. So what was the reason? So let's leave the political and other reasons aside. In terms of economics, what was the major factor which actually destroyed their industry? And that was this freight equalization policy. What does it say? The policy said that whatever mineral is available in Jharkhand, for example, it's available at the same cost practically anywhere else in the country. So then why would someone put their industry in Jharkhand? They would rather put it next to a coast or where there is, some other advantage. So that was the reason that these states, even though they had the raw material to begin with, nothing happened there and they got destroyed practically in terms of economic policy. So that deindustrialized the mineral rich states in India. Why am I saying this? Because the same thing is happening when you send your data outside the country, more particularly personal data. Okay. Now let's see what happens in the case of patenting innovations. Patents are enforced by jurisdiction. There's nothing like a global patent. Data goes outside the country means typically the algorithms will be executed outside the country, naturally. So then what happens to your patent filing in the country, in India? Well, that is of no use because the algos are executed outside the country. So your patents in India are a waste. Then somebody will say, okay, then why should I file a patent? So it has a chain reaction on the entire ecosystem. Why should I patent? And your entire innovation and patenting ecosystem takes a real hit because of your data going outside the country. And algorithms are the ones which are used to mine. That is the main thing in today's business, right? So then you send that out of the country. So your servers will also go out. Your data servers, your storage servers, algorithms, everything goes out. So the entire chain goes out and your patenting and innovation takes a real hit. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other thing, and this is specifically about personal data, not data in general, but personal data, which is what we should distinguish. Freedom of speech. When you're on Twitter, there's some policy, who is platform, deplatform, etc., etc. That is unique to every country, individual civilization. That requires really localization, okay? National level things to handle it, essentially. Even this aspect is contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we'll see in a later slide, just for information. I have that here. Okay. Next point. I think just go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Individuals cannot negotiate foreign data servers, jurisdictions, licenses, regulators, forex. So basically, what happens? Someone commits a financial crime, Malia and whoever, Modi, etc., etc. They just go to St. Kitts and London. That's the same idea out here. Okay. And the other thing, this is also important. You are relying on foreign entities because the fiduciary typically is a foreign entity in India, right? The big ones. And you are telling Twitter or Facebook to, do your job. You meaning the government. So would you ask the CIA or FBI, some, arm of the US state? See, the fiduciary, these fiduciaries are basically, they are agents of US deep state. Okay. I'll come to that in a later slide if you don't take it for now. So relying on foreign entities for day-to-day admin work, is that really a thing of your control and your sovereignty and your governance? And real-time data for law enforcement, how soon will you get it? Will you get it? They will play games, if they can, which is precisely why people go abroad. Next point, next slide, please. Okay, what is the impact on economy and business? So annual revenues are like billions of dollars. Market cap is like trillions of dollars. India revenues maybe 5%, 10%, I don't know. But data is flowing out, personal data is flowing out, tens of billions of US dollars. So, for example, just from advertising, the top 3 or 4 big tech in India, they made something like 50,000 crores in 1 year. Okay. So that's the kind of money which we are talking about. And what about my rights? We talked about value in the data irrespective of identifiability or de-identifiability. So what about my monetization and my rights? I've created the content, or it's my information. I have exclusive rights and control over it. And what about revenue generation for the government? Due to monetization, patenting, all that ties in. So there's a huge opportunity cost and strategic cost. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so I think much of this I will go through very fast. You have only thing to note is cyber physical systems. So the harm can be directly to the data principle, and I need all control on my personal data, whether it's for legal purposes or current purposes or whatever activity I'm doing now. For the Universal Declaration of Human rights exist. Expression is not affected by the nature of the medium, whether it's digital, analog, or whatever. So why should that come into the picture? And human rights include everything: privacy, ownership, monetization, moral rights, cultural expression, remedies, local jurisdiction, everything. Narratives also, it's important, personal data, Twitter and all, they're setting the narrative. But narratives, they are two legitimate narratives. For example, there's a cricket match, there's a winning side and a losing side. So each side has their own narrative, so to speak. So whose policies and whose controls will set the narrative in your country? That is the question. Next slide, please. Okay. So just look at the last point in bold out here. I think the rest of it we know. Basically, you can target any entity. This is a point weapon. You can target the individual. This is a group or area weapon because you can target any group by any kind of parameter, whether it's a religion, electorate, social, gender, identity, activity, whatever you want. And it is civilizational also, right? So basically it's like an intelligence dossier which you are handing in somebody's hands when you're talking about personal data specifically, as opposed to data in general. So everything is under threat, basically. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at the ecosystem. And since fiduciary is the key, let's look at what has been happening, fiduciary. The Schrems 2 case happened, so even a strong law like GDPR was not sufficient, not good enough, because these guys are so big, they are bigger than the law, they are a law unto themselves. And big tech is integrated into US deep state. There have been, inquiries in the US Congress. They have been calling executives of Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and pulling them up for violating the privacy and fundamental rights of US citizens, including representatives and senators and so on. So they don't even care about them, right? So big tech has been weaponized by the US federal government. And these proceedings have been going on in the US Congress, the US Senate. So what do you mean by trusted territory? The trust has to do with the person and where is it there, right? Big tech cartels, we know, deplatformed Trump, and our minister, Ravi Shankar Prasad, he was deplatformed. Nexus with malicious agents is very much possible. So if you had Jack Dorsey, if you have Elon Musk, it's going to be different. It depends on their ideology and their nexus, so who are their friends and so on. And if you have data in a foreign land, you have algorithms in a foreign land which are taking over. You don't have control or oversight over algorithms in a foreign land. That is the other point, right? Just to put one small piece of information which is interesting. The next point, Facebook, this ad was there on LinkedIn. Actual job description for a public policy manager located in Delhi. it contained, essentially in suitable language, intervention with the Election Commission and electoral laws. So, so these guys why are they interested in talking about our democracy? And they have your personal data. They can target the person. They can target the citizen. So they are targeting the democracy. So now this is what we know about big tech. They are basically quasi-world governments. Next slide, please. So the personal data bill essentially has to do with security, human rights, and liberty of the individual, of course. And it's not only privacy and the comprehensive national security of the state. And the other paradigm is that my personal data is me, minus the flesh and bones. It's everything about me. You can reconstruct me, right? It's everything. Next slide, please. So what is personal data? Next slide, please. Okay, so I think we've talked about this. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of a person's ideas, blah, 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 in your entire life, expression of liberty. Okay, others can impact the data. So if there's a policy on Twitter or some policy, let me give you a concrete example. So for, let's say there's some algorithm which makes some photos or, dishes out pictures of a human being. And then it puts labels. Now, suppose it does that and puts a label called Muhammad, just for example. That might not be acceptable, and that might create a very bad situation depending on where you are and what you're talking about, right? So others can impact the data. So people have been deplatformed, there have been vaccine related narratives. If you're not going along with the flow, then you've had it. You can be shadow banned, or it can be worse. So all that happens. Next slide, please. Okay. Right. So personal data is a living entity, because you can have, let's say, data about an individual. You've just recorded the birth. The real-time clock of the computer is going on. Nothing changes. You have not made any update to the data set. Only the clock has become, plus 18 years. So now that data set, just because of the RTC stamp, it talks about an adult, and different rights kick in. So another point to notice is we are talking about privacy and fundamental rights, human rights, and individuals' liberties, like my rights. Suppose there's a defamation case, somebody else writes that piece of, that journalistic piece. Somebody else owns it. Somebody else has copyright to it. Somebody else has uh, making money out of it. But it is my right which is affected, isn't it? That is why I file for defamation. So the point I'm trying to make is that my liberties exist even in non-personal data, even if somebody else owns it. And here, this bill has to do justice to my personal data, and it's not doing that. Next slide, please. Okay. I think we can skip this. Next, please. Right. Yeah, we can skip this as well. Next, please. Okay. So essentially, we are talking about my fundamental rights and human rights. That is really the issue. So, and as I said, I'm not talking about privacy or identifiability. I'm talking about the owner and my exclusive rights and control. So I want to go from data principal to data owner. Okay, and all the rights which come with it. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is important, data and processing. So as if, just because of this new technology, there's some kind of funny bird which is flying about the place. If you really think about it, data of human activity has always been there. Like if you go to a doctor, you call a plumber to your home, a carpenter, you have a driver, you know what personal data to share with whom online, what kind of access to give. The doctor will tell you, I want this information, what is your fever, your condition, blah, blah, blah. And you give that, right? So it has always been around. The doctor makes a note, somebody makes a record on some other kind of medium, whether it's paper, whether it's a tablet, electronic, or whatever it is. The fact remains that data has always been there, and processing has always been there. The doctor is processing using real intelligence. He's processing the data that you're giving him. He's processing using real intelligence. Now, the whole point of AI is to replace that real by artificial. Then why should it change my rights? Why should it diminish the rights of the patient or the individual? So that is the question I'm asking. Because the nature of the medium is different, I mean, so what? Why should my rights change? At least the core of my rights. And why then will it be a human right and fundamental right if that is impacted by it? So that is the question. Next slide, please. Okay, geopolitical considerations. So we know the G20 entire thing happened over the year. So there was this slogan called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Is it a slogan, just a slogan, or a principle? Now let's see what is happening in the US, the regulatory system, and what happened, to the vaccine narratives, COVID, etc., as a result of that. I'm not taking a view whether this is right or wrong. I'm just saying this is what happened. Okay. So what was the regulatory system? Basically, centralized authority. It will prescribe. It will say what is good or bad. If you don't go with the flow, then it will prescribe. Next, you will be penalized or you will be pulled up by lawyers. You can be deplatformed, etc. So that is how it goes. So there is a central authority. They will say what is good. If you don't follow it, then you are a bad guy. So different levels of punishment which you face, and so on. And even if you see the world, what is happening, for example, in Ukraine, vis-a-vis what US tried to push India into. Either you are with us or with them, and India resisted. Canada, Khalistan, Samuel Huntington, you must have heard of this clash of civilizations. So you are with us or you are with them, either or. Centralized authority, go with the flow, do this or else. So big tech is basically doing that. Okay, so that is coming from their cultural framework. Whereas in our ethos, what is it that we have largely? So the axiom of choice. So basically, in our ethos in India, in the Hindu ethos, so to speak, I own the rights. I decide. I have the axiom of choice as an individual. Why am I saying that? And what is the artifact which does that? Well, because in a manner of speaking, I choose my own gods within quotes. Okay. And even if I choose no God, I'm still within the system. I'm not out of the system. I'm not a bad guy. I'm not penalized. So I have granular control. I have the ultimate control vested in each and every single person. Why am I bringing that here? Because then you can say that I have the choice to be or not to be online. Or if I'm online, I will have granular control about what thing belongs to me. And that will play itself out when we are talking about, for example, going online, digital or personal data, and what all can we do with that. So that is the way we are. So that's a cultural artifact. And the artifact which does this is basically, everyone is called Lakshmi, Ganpati, Mahesh, Umesh. So you are infinite, so to speak, notionally. And that is why, axiom of choice is a subset. Right to free speech, expression, all that is a subset of this peculiar artifact. So that is the point. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is a famous quote, Henry Kissinger from the US. Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control the people. But data is the new oil. So whoever controls data, all lets go of the control of data. You are letting go of your control. You are letting go of your nation. And data it controls the people also, right? Because it's directly, personal data is directly about the people. So data is doing both together. It's such a weapon, huge. Code and algorithms, the trinity, code, algorithms, and personal data is a weapon of mass destruction. I'm talking about personal data, distinguish it from data in general. So the DPDP Act, basically, what does it look like? A contest between three persons, the owner, that is the principal, government and big tech. So far, the owner has been put down in this act, and the other two have a conflict of interest with the owner, right? So they are winning in this round in as far as this bill is concerned. So for personal data, I think we should have an exit strategy in the mid to long term, by and large, barring exceptions, to get out of this, data going outside or foreign dependency, whatever it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now it's almost 5 minutes more, and I'll finish with that. So recommendations. Instead of data principal, go to data owner. Because I own it, it's exclusively my data. It's non-assignable. You cannot override a fundamental right, and therefore you cannot override my personal data, and more specifically my personal information, by any business contract, because it's fundamental and personal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. So okay, here last point, I'm just giving you the granularity in the rights. Next slide, please. Okay. We have talked about the idea expression dichotomy. So the data principal has a right to be informed of data breach, say within 1 week or whatever. So the act doesn't prescribe this time limit. And here, this next point is important, I feel, that each company website, let's say it pays an appropriate amount. Let's say it's even 1 rupee per company or website that you hit, and nil for startups to each citizen. Hold it with the government and use it for protecting the citizens, So the point here is that I own something and you have to pay me for that, and you have to acknowledge the fact that I am the master. That is the point. A redefinition of personal data so that the identifiability bit is basically broadened. Next slide, please. Recommendations, DPB, yeah, it should be accountable, say to the parliament, I feel. Officials of DPB should have a non-compete, because this is precisely the thing which has screwed up the entire, regulatory framework of the US, and which is why the big tech of US, actually it reflects the deep state of the US, So have a non-compete or cooling off period between corporates or someone else and somebody joining the data protection board. Well, permit injunctions, etc. So that comes with all your other rights and remedies. Next slide, please. So localization we've talked about. Next slide, please. Okay, penalty should be proportional to the breach and harm, and some compensation should be made to me, the data owner. Otherwise, what am I getting out of it? Conflicts, because different situations already have so many things happening. So the harmonious construction of laws that should be used. That seems to make sense. Digital is not defined. It doesn't seem to make sense. So why don't you drop it? Rules should be placed, and use the rules after notification. That is the important point, I feel. It's not exhaustive. Next point. Next slide, please. Okay. So here, this is just one example. So we have profiles on the mobile phone, meeting profile, silent profile, whatever. So in a similar fashion, you can have different profiles if you are online and you are hitting a government site or a corporate, or your purpose is basically transaction or something else, So you can have different profiles. Private entity, for example, an anonymous profile, no data collection. That is the bottom line. I'm saying you have the choice to upgrade or give more data if you want, but that profile and that control is with you, the data principal or the owner rather. And in case of government, let's say bare minimum required for national security purposes, otherwise nothing. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we'll skip this. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, just for information and to place this entire thing in context. Everyone has a right to effective remedy. So what is the effective remedy that this bill is giving me? I don't think it is giving me any effective remedy at all for acts violating the fundamental rights, which, for example, is privacy. Article 12, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference, right to protection of the law. I'm just reading out the bold-faced thing, right? So you have that right. What is the protection I have? Next slide, please. Okay, right to freedom of opinion and expression. And the last phrase in the boldface, right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. So the nature of the media is not the issue. So that is what we need to keep in mind when we are talking about personal data and something which can impinge on opinion and expression. Cultural life, next article 27, cultural life of the community. The last point is important. Everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. Personal data, I'm the author of everything. So I have the right, and I have all the rights. I have the exclusive rights. So that is it. Next, please. Article 28. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms can be fully realized. I don't think this bill is doing that. Article 30 is important. No state, group, or person has any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. So herein refers to the Declaration of Human Rights. But I'm saying 43A has been taken out, RTI has been taken out. Using the law of conflicts, the other things which might be available to me could possibly be taken out. So you are, using these sections in this bill, you're basically destroying my rights, isn't it? Next slide, please. Well, I'm done. So if you have questions, thank you for your time and interest. If there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sahay. That was quite an interesting take on DPDPA. And now we are open to discussion and questions.
I think some questions I have already placed in the chat box. I request Pankaj sir, who spoke brilliantly, to look into that, especially the last one, where my last resort also might have been stolen now.
Can you give me?
Okay, I can. I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
Kodandran sir has asked a question on validity of Section 43 damages involving personal data, where this damages to be paid to victim could be contested as when there is a conflict, the new law will take over.
Yeah. Okay.
And Section 43.
Extracts of 43 also, where I have given this, kindly see, Section 41. Can you read it for me, ma?
Yes, Section 43, penalty and compensation for damage to computer system, etc. If any person without permission of the owner or any other person who is in charge of a computer system or computer network, he shall be liable to pay damages by way of compensation to the person so affected.
Yeah, so this is talking about damage to computer and computer system, whereas the act is about personal data. Okay. So unless there is a linkage between through the click wrap agreement or whatever, unless there's a way that linkage between personal data and this computer system is made out, this will stand independent without the conflict thing coming in play. Okay. So I don't know how it will actually work out, but it might not. I don't know really. But in case of personal data, yes, if there's a conflict, then it's the DPDPA which will override, and then you have lost. 43A is gone anyway. That is there.
Even 43, when he overtakes, don't you think personal data gets negated there?
Yeah, I think there's a link, but I can't at this time. I don't have a very informed opinion on that. But I get your point, and I think it is likely, though I don't know. I don't have a very good opinion on that at the moment.
Any lawyer, Mr. Limai or somebody will be in a better position.
Maybe a lawyer. I'm not officially a lawyer.
Kodandram, can I answer your question?
Certainly, sir. I will be very glad. Sir, you have entered as Xiaomi, so I did not see.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay. Otherwise, you would have directed me. Okay. No. Section 43 will remain. Why do you think it gets overridden? Okay, see, it is not in conflict with anything which is there in this act. So where there is no conflict, whatever this act provides is in addition to and not in derogation of other acts. Okay. 43 capital A has been specifically removed, but 43 has not been removed. And 43 is a very generic section. It applies to any access to data without authorization of the owner of either the computer or even the data owner. You see, data in a computer resource is, of course, if you talk of personal data, you can say it belongs to the individual, but the individual transfers part of this right to the platform where he is hosting the data. Now, 43 says that if you do not have the permission of the platform owner, then whatever access you have, downloading, etc., all that can give rise to a claim of compensation to the affected person. And another thing, See, this particular act, the DPDPA, may not provide the compensation to the data principal in this act. It does not say you cannot take the compensation from Information Technology Act, Section 43. It doesn't go away. Therefore, the data principal not having a remedy under this act, it only means that there is a different act in which you can take the remedy. See, when the nation makes laws, it is not that all rights have to be given in one single legislation. There will be multitude of legislations. Each is meant for a different purpose. In one legislation, there may be a criminal punishment. In another, there may be a civil penalty. So likewise, DPDPA talks about disciplining the industry. It is a law for the data fiduciaries. And if any data principal has any reason to lodge a complaint, he lodges a complaint, but compensation, if he wants, he has to go to the Information Technology Act. See, this principle is also there in criminal law. See, if you have observed a cognizable offense, as a dutiful citizen of the country, you are supposed to go and report it to the police. It doesn't mean that if any compensation is there, so somebody, let us say, is conducting a robbery or something like that, okay, and you report it to the police. Maybe some 10 lakhs or 100 lakhs money or property is recovered because you gave the complaint. It doesn't mean that a part of that should come to you. You are doing your duty to ensure that the society, this kind of crimes are brought to the attention of the law enforcement. Same way here, you as a data principal, whether you are affected directly or not, you bring it to the knowledge of the Data Protection Board. They will impose penalty on the data fiduciary. You still have your right to go to the adjudicator of Information Technology Act and claim your compensation. So let us look at DPDPA as an extension of Information Technology Act. See, Section 43, capital A goes out. In its place, 44 sections of DPDPA has come. So therefore, the ITA 2000 as well as this act will remain and they will work together. So therefore, certain things are there in this act and certain things are there in ITA 2000. ITA 2000 itself tomorrow may be further amended, and maybe the criminal aspects which are there in section, chapter 11 of Information Technology Act may all go to IPC. We can't prevent that from happening. Then government will say, you take IPC for some remedies, take ITA 2000 for some other remedies, take DPDPA for some other remedies. It is all fine. It is a question of whether it is convenient or inconvenient. But from the perspective of lawmaking, it is also kind of an option. And government has decided that this DPDPA will be an industry regulatory kind of an act. In Information Technology Act, we have been repeatedly telling that cyber crimes cannot be prevented until the intermediaries are disciplined. The disciplining of the intermediaries is not strong enough in ITA 2000, but here the entire act is only on the compliance requirements, like reasonable security practices. So look at that from that limited perspective. Don't expect everything to be achieved through DPDPA. You have to understand and appreciate that this has a limited objective and it will be focusing only on that. Government tried several things earlier, PDPB 2018, 2019, 98 sections were there. Everybody opposed it. Nobody wanted data localization at that time. In fact, the big tech and others were ready to shoot down the law at any cost if you introduce data localization. DSCI itself gave a dissenting opinion to the Sri Krishna committee opposing data localization. So there was such a lot of opposition to certain aspects. What government has done this time is, let us get this minimal law passed. And maybe at some point of time in future, we will try to make changes. Even if you take section 16, today there is no restrictions on data transfer. But government can very well bring in certain things. So they can bring all the countries under a blacklist and release one by one based on adequacy. So these are all options which are available to the government. And I think strategically the government has taken a decision that we will get the act passed with minimal of opposition, and then we will see what happens later. This is my view. And section 43 definitely remains, and it is going to be more used today than yesterday. That is, the adjudicator of ITA 2000 may have to handle hundreds of complaints from data principals for compensation. So that aspect will remain. And we have to gear up the adjudicators. That is the reason why I'm saying Jago regulators, Jago, we have to train the adjudicators about DPDPA. Today, adjudicators of Tamil Nadu, ITA 2000, who are IT secretaries, are barely learning Information Technology Act. Now we have to make them learn about DPDPA. So that if that is done, then there are enough powers under Information Technology Act for the adjudicator to provide compensation without much of a problem. Up to 5 crores a person can claim individually compensation. If your personal data is worth 5 crores, you have the right to claim 5 crores for loss of your personal data or a group's personal data from the ITA adjudicator. So look at a DPDPA as one of the segments of law, and then perhaps some of these issues will not be there. In fact, it was a good session in the sense that a lot of issues have been raised. It is difficult to answer all those queries in one of this thing. We require a lot more time. I will actually look at the presentation once again and perhaps raise more of the issues. But this particular section 43, I have said what I wanted to inform. That also should address Harish. Okay. Data principal does not get any benefit. He will get benefit under ITA 2000 if he has suffered any loss. That is only compensation for the loss. If you just give some information that a data fiduciary is violating the law, it is not like an income tax thing where you would expect, say, incentives. Okay, maybe it may come on a later day. I don't know. Today, if you give a tip to income tax, you get 25% of the recovery or something like that. Maybe something like that can be introduced as at some point of time as an incentive, but that is not law. Okay, in the law, you have a duty to report if you know that there is a wrongdoing by somebody, and government will take the action. Okay, Subraidu. Some of the criticisms you have are also true for most privacy legislations. Yes, but of course we are today.
That courier example that was taken, no? That you reaching into your pocket and giving the data versus the courier guy getting into your pocket. See, that is the way in which most social media platforms take the data, right? So that look more like the criticism of existing privacy laws.
Everything today revolves around consent. Okay, if you don't have given the consent, and if somebody goes beyond the consent, then you have to invoke this particular provision. Now, that is why consent managers are there. Then make use of the consent managers. Consent managers are going to be the organizations which have to help the data principals from getting the benefits of this law. Okay. Yeah.
Extremely happy, Pankaj ji. We got a lot of inputs. Very happy.
No, yeah, he has given tons of information on which we can keep on debating for another 10 JVS.
Yes. Rightly said, sir.
On many of the points, I think, particularly the data localization point, I think is absolutely 100% true. In fact, if you remember, Navi sir, when Justice C. Krishna was there, this exact question that I had asked him. That the 10% of market user base, or maybe at least even 20% of user base of all these tech companies are in India. And at that point in time, they had allowed a copy to be shipped out, although localization is there, and now even that is not allowed.
No,
and that is not
say
required.
data. I am a strong advocate of the data localization. Okay, from the beginning.
Yes,
In fact,
yes,
I have highlighted the civil case, the TransUnion civil, and I have called it as data laundering. So I agree that there should be strict data localization, but it has not been done now. As I told you, I will presume that it is a strategy to get things moving. Otherwise, it would permanently get stuck as it has in the last few years. Okay.
But sir, on the previous question, the previous answer that you gave, would it be an interpretation? If it might be, I mean, somebody can, as Dr. Sahay was saying, I agree with him that, you are saying there's no conflict between 43 section and the other. Say, for example, if some personal data loss happens to me, a court can take a view that because there is already an act of Personal Data Protection Act 23, if any loss is there and any monetary compensation has to be paid to, any monetary compensation or any fine has got to be levied, there is clearly a conflict between DPDPA and Section 43. Therefore, DPDPA will prevail. That interpretation, that possibility of such an interpretation.
No, you are talking of a principle called double jeopardy. Okay, that is, a person cannot claim remedy for the same thing from two regulations. So here, data principle is not given the remedy here. So therefore, he can go to the ITA 2000. Suppose this act had said data principle will get 500 rupees for every data or something like that. Then it would have been a case where a remedy is available in this particular thing, whether it is sufficient, adequate, that is subject to judicial review. Therefore, going to another legislation for a similar this thing would be a double jeopardy issue. But here, not having the remedy in DPDPA means that remedy from other legislations are still open. Okay.
We hope it.
That is my view again.
Yeah, correct.
You take it as the interpretation. Okay.
Many points were very valid actually.
There is one question from Mr. Hari. She is asking if you can elaborate on the different profiles. Who has to create this different profile and who is responsible? Yes.
Yeah, so I think that has to be maybe standards driven or regulation driven. I don't know, but I have to have the different profiles on the client side with me, and I have to have the control.
Yeah, that again, consent manager can do, according to me. The consent manager under DPDPA is a completely different animal than the consent manager under the account aggregators scheme. And this consent manager can collect the complete personal data set from the data principle. From out of that, create multiple profiles, including anonymized profile, and then share it or disclose it to respective data fiduciaries based on their need. So that provision is there. But today, people are not understanding the consent manager's profile properly because they are only comparing it with the account aggregator's technology system. This is not only a technology system, it is actually a completely different proposition.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Anyone has comments, please speak up.
Anyway, Pankaj, thank you. I will separately look at this copyright issues which you have said, patent issue, those I cannot immediately.
The idea expression dichotomy part, you mean?
Yeah, that I will have to.
I think that is quite important.
Yeah, I have to see that separately again. Okay. But anyway, thanks for generating so much of thoughts which are good. Some of this when we were discussing the shape of things to come. Okay, you should see the series of articles which I wrote at that time. When there was no law in India, we didn't know what kind of law would come. So we had a complete freedom to think whatever is our wish list. So at that time, I had raised some issues. But anyway, now those are things of the past. So we have this law right now. We have to make good with this law, because the only option, if we don't like this law, is to actually scrap this law and go for another exercise of rewriting the law. Probably some people may go to the court also, but scope for going to the court is very little, because the government has simply made it a very, you can say, shortened piece, so that there may not be much of reason for court to accept any objections to the law.
Sir, one more comment. I think on the rulemaking, I read that slide. You had suggested that rulemaking should be made by Parliament and all. I think that is a bit different. Generally, even if you look at income tax law or any other law, the rulemaking is generally drafted to the implementers, either the departments and all. And in case somebody, in case any disputes arise, whether it be circulars or anything, the only route is to go back to the court, and the court can overrule and repeat it. For example, income tax, many cases, departmental circulars have been overruled and clearly stated that the circular is not the law. What has been passed by Parliament is the law. So in case of any conflict between a rule created by bureaucrats versus the law passed by Parliament, it's a more difficult route to adopt, I agree, to negate any rule. But still, that suggestion seems to be completely out of tune with what is normally, even in other acts, not just the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. But what's your take on that?
No, so actually every rule is placed before the Parliament, but not before it is passed, after it is passed, and Parliament can negate it if you want, if they want. So rules need to be ratified by the Parliament. Okay. And that is what is being done in other cases also. I think that will be followed. But what happens?
For example, income tax. Yeah, income tax would come across many case laws. Typically, this department keeps passing circulars and rules and all. So many disputes end up in the court. And then if whenever there is a conflict between a circular or rule between the act, the courts have come down and said that no, they've quashed, they've negated the circulars and and whatever rules, and declared them as going against the spirit of the law as passed by Parliament, and negated them.
It can be done.
Yeah.
The courts have all the powers. Courts have powers even after the Parliament ratifies it also.
Yeah, correct. That's right.
Okay, but the department has to place it before the Parliament.
Oh, is it?
Then,
I didn't know.
Yeah. Department has to place it in the immediate next session, which is either 30 days or more. If it is a short 4-day session like what happened this time, it is not necessary. But if the next session is 30 days plus, any notification made during that period have to be placed in the immediate next session. Which means that the parliamentarians have the right to reject if they want. If the opposition has got the strength, they can reject it. But if that is not possible, if it gets passed, you still have a judicial review. See, the digital media related notifications under ITA 2000 has been questioned, not only in Supreme Court, even in a very high court. There are courts like Mumbai High Court which will give you immediate relief. They will even stop the, give a stay on the notification. So courts are very much proactive today to stop anything which has got any elements of doubt on human rights or anything of that sort. So same thing has to be used here also.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Pankaj.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time.
Yeah. Manju?
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. Sahay. That was a very thought-provoking sessions, and as Navi sir mentioned, you have raised enough questions and points which can last multiple discussions like this. And thank you for joining us. And we would like to listen more from you on this topic sometime in the future. And thank you for joining. Thank you everyone for joining the discussion. Good night.
Thank you and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.